who gets the bad news of capitalism. It is both women of all races and men of color. The negative effects of the bad news of capitalism may differ across time and space. And today in the United States, for example, I think that, and our research showed that disproportionately it's men of color and women of color who get the bad news of capitalism. So race seems to be a stronger stratifier in this context in the US than gender. But if you were to go to South Korea, gender is much more dominant as a stratifier. I'm Stephanie Seguino. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Vermont. We've begun to look at how inequality affects economic growth and development, and in particular, gender inequality. We knew before that macroeconomic growth and policies have gendered effects, and we know that from the structural adjustment policies of the 1990s and 80s, for example, and we know it with the most recent Great Recession, that there are differential effects. But the powerhouse of work has really been on understanding how gender inequality has impacts on economic growth. And so there's this two-way causality. And that's really the nexus of this issue, is that if you have macroeconomic policies that actually disadvantage women, for example, and gender inequality has negative effects on economic growth, essentially you are blunting the benefits of those macroeconomic policies, right? You're undermining the efficacy of those policies. So the task has been to really make macro theory more relevant in terms of these gender dynamics, which have real effects on the material economy. In particular, the work that I've looked at is gender wage inequality has actually been a stimulus to economic growth in export-oriented economies. In many ways, people are not comfortable with that finding because I think people want, economists want to make the argument that equality is good for growth, but I don't think we can deny the fact that suppressing wages raises profits and stimulates investment. And in economies that are exporters, low wages for women in labor-intensive industries makes exports cheaper, and it stimulates export growth. So that's one trajectory. That's one pathway, is in labor markets, and in particular labor market discrimination. The real question, the central question, I think, for all of us is how can we have equity with growth? And so what that tells us is that export-led growth strategy of segregating women into the labor-intensive export sector is maybe a short-run strategy for stimulating employment and growth. In the long run, it's not going to be a successful strategy because things that disempower women relative to men also have negative effects on children and labor productivity in the long run. So the real challenge for us is to think about what are the policies in which equity is compatible with growth, whether that is gender equity or racial equity or class equity. That's really our task. And so we have to come back to the issue, what are the macroeconomic policies that will facilitate that relationship? It's, and I think the wrong thing to extract from all of this is that somehow inequality is something we should pursue because it's good for growth, because its benefits really are in the short run. In the long run, inequality depletes our ability to take care of people. And it therefore has really negative effects on labor productivity, but it has huge social costs in terms of mental health, in terms of crime, in terms of poor performance in school. We know a lot, for example, that a mother's depression, a mother's financial status, and many other attributes of women's well-being has negative effects on children even in utero that lead to cognitive deficits through their entire lifetime. So the real challenges for us is to figure out how we can support investments in people, because that is really what is going to stimulate growth in the long run. Gender equality creates fiscal space. So what do we mean by fiscal space? Countries that say they don't have fiscal space means that they don't have enough public revenue for these expenditures. And if we were to only look at it at a moment in time, that's understandable. But the way to think about this is that these expenditures are not discretionary expenditures, they are investments. There's no business that invests and assumes that it will have immediate rate of return on their investment, right? It's a longer run strategy. And so by investing in gender equality in terms of public or social infrastructure, by that I mean education, healthcare, and so forth, you end up raising labor productivity. you end up stimulating economic growth. That growth leads to higher incomes that can be taxed to pay the cost of the initial investment. So that's what I mean by these investments creating fiscal space. The point is that these investments take time to yield a rate of return, right? 5 or 10 years. And so once again, I think we really have to begin thinking about government expenditures, not as discretionary spending about how do we reduce poverty or, how do we help people that don't have enough money for food, but to think about it with an investment lens, that these investments do pay off. And our challenge as economists is to be able to more carefully quantify those effects and the stream of revenue. And the work that's really inspired me in this is the work of James Heckman, who's a University of Chicago economist whose focus has been on early childhood education. And what he has found is that $1 invested today in early childhood education yields a 700% rate of return. Nobody can argue with that, right? And I think there's a lot of evidence that there are similar returns from investments in gender equality. And our task as economists is to provide that empirical evidence and to work with policymakers to be able to reframe the fact that public spending is really public investment. In a study that I did recently, in roughly 70% of the countries in which women's employment relative to men's had increased, in 70% of those countries, men's employment rate had declined. So what we're seeing is what I think is evident in recent elections, that there's a male backlash, and that we cannot have gender equality at the expense, that is, women's well-being improving at the expense of men's. But globalization has really led to job shortages that have resulted in that phenomenon. And I think anybody that wants to talk about gender equality has to look at the fact that men also have been disadvantaged in this period of time, and that unless we address this demand side problem of a shortage of jobs, what we will have is gender conflict with gender equality. And that's really not sustainable, and it's not healthy, as we've seen recently. I think we're seeing what we see in terms of right-wing governments in Europe and in other parts of the world, and the recent election in the United States, is that insecurity exacerbates the desire to protect one's own group and to reinforce stereotypes and norms that are really negative towards the group that you want to protect yourself from, whether that is women or people of color.